little bit better when we go through. Before we start, anybody knows the Allman Brothers Band would know that song, Eat a Peach. The young lady's wearing that shirt right now. This is, just as I started this assignment, I lost a very dear friend. This is Cinnamon Catlin-Legutko. This is the two of us. She and I made a lot of good trouble together over the years. Cinnamon had a fierce commitment to access and inclusion and a belief in the power of the nation's small museums. That's where I knew her first. They're really the backbone of the public memory in America, I think. And this is where the most action's happening in my field, in the museum field. They're the foundation of the public humanities. They're ways that lots of us engage in the humanities outside of the classroom regularly. When someone you love dies, it's really up to you to carry their memories. Those of us in the museum business know that people keep memories in a variety of ways, including art, artifacts, documents, and all sorts of ephemera. I'm proud that one of the memories I have with my friend Cinnamon is the discussions that we had in books and articles. It's a version of the unending conversation, a concept I learned my very first semester of graduate school. Our final collaboration was when she asked me to contribute to the Inclusive Museum Leader, her final book. You're a man on a committed journey, and readers need to hear from you, she told me. It's that journey I want to talk about today. It's a story of how the contemporary South made this contemporary Southerner. I'm as proud of the piece I wrote for her, What Kind of Ancestor Will I Be, as anything I've written. She asked me for a plea to white male leaders who sit in power to work inclusively and make change. Cinnamon's bar was incredibly high, and I met it. Cinnamon was courageous, and she spoke truth to power. She was inclusive in her words and actions. She was one of my dearest friends and co-conspirators. So I'm going to dedicate this to her tonight. So let's start with who I am. And then we're going to start at the Martin County Public Library, just up the road from where these folks are from. Mariana and Kevin over there, my good friends, which I'll talk to in just a second. It was 1985. That was a really long time ago, before the turn of the century. My 7th grade teacher assigned us a 45-page research paper. I'm just going to say 45-page handwritten research paper. I could spit out a 45-page paper now without much trouble, but in 7th grade, it was pretty dang hard. I lacked a subject. By this point, I'd been playing guitar for a couple years, and I was fascinated with the music of the late 1970s. Dad owned the record on the left, Jimi Hendrix's Are You Experienced, which was a real outlier in his collection that skewed more heavily toward Hank Williams, bluegrass, and folk music. I stared at that cover on the left, and I was pretty sure I wasn't experienced. But I was also sure I knew how I was going to get experienced, and that was going to be listening to the record. And from those first notes of Purple Haze on side A, I have been hooked ever since. I soon got a Fender Stratocaster in honor of Jimmy, which is funny because the Allman Brothers play mostly Gibson Les Pauls. I'm a Strat guy and have been since the beginning of time, since before I knew I should have leaned toward a Les Paul. I learned the entire song of Purple Haze. It's actually, I think, the first song I learned all the way through solos and everything else. And at some point, I rented a video. Who remembers going to the store and renting videos? And I saw the Monterey Pop Festival movie. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's pretty incredible, by the Mazeless Brothers. That's where Jimmy lit his guitar on fire and really made his name there. But what I also saw, what looked like a really good time for the participants. And that's going to bring me back to this 45-page paper. I needed a topic, and I chose the hippies, simply because I loved their music. One of my primary sources was this Time magazine issue that's on the right here. It was in a bound volume at the Martin County Public Library. Do y'all remember that? They would take the weeklies and they would bind them. This is not microfilm, but you had to go in there. And it was kind of cool. It was like pulling the encyclopedia out, and you got to see all this. And Time was a color publication, so it was beautiful to look at. You know, it wasn't just looking at microfilm, which also, by the way, makes me motion sick when I look at. You know, any researchers here can nod and do that there. The color photographs just really captured my imagination. More than that, this issue covered the Monterey Pop Festival that Jimmy had just played. So as I was looking for stuff, I basically didn't know what the hell I was looking for. I was just in the library capturing the imagination as I go through. But the story of Monterey Pop, as I watched what was going on in the movie, and as I read about the story in this burgeoning movement, it really piqued my curiosity. That paper, by the way, which I wrote in longhand with an eraser-mate pen. Okay, now remember that because my hand would slide all over it. Eraser-mates did not. Thank you, Mariana, for supporting that. I wrote it in huge cursive so I could get 45 pages. The paper doesn't survive. It kills me. I've been through everything. I have some crappy stuff in my archives, but not that paper. But the ideas that assignment sparked resulted in me being here today, all in a 7th grade classroom at Redeemer Lutheran School and a public library in Stuart, Florida. One thing I learned from that effort was the sense of music as a collective. I've been chasing that feeling my entire life. Eventually, I discovered, and I will always do this, and it says it in the book, discovered the Allman Brothers Band. I use quotes because when you're my age, I was born in 1971, you grew up with the Allman Brothers Band. You couldn't escape them. They were on the radio. Ramblin' Man had just been a hit about 10 years before I was a teenager in the early 1970s. So I knew who the Allman Brothers were in 1993. But when I discovered them and they grabbed my craw, honestly, this is no lie, it's been 30 years. I probably have never gone a week without listening to something Allman Brothers related since. And that includes, it's not just at Fillmore East. It's all the offshoot bands and everything else, several of whom Tedeschi Trucks, Doug mentioned early. So as we go into this story today, and I did a bookend, here's very early publicity shot, Rose Hill Cemetery, the Bond Memorial. On the right, this is the final Beacon show. Just had a picture of that to kind of bookend. As we go into this today, I want to tell you I am an academically trained historian, but I am absolutely not unbiased when I approach the story of the Allman Brothers Band. I rank them among the greatest, most significant rock bands in history. My journey started with a CD called Decade of Hits that I got from the BMG Music Club. I actually signed up my roommate Fletch for that and got it. And the title's a misnomer. If you're aware, the Allman Brothers really were not a hits band. It offered a good overview of their career. The sound, to me, was wholly original to the Allman Brothers. There were blues covers, there were original songs, there was some country going on there. The ballads were haunting and beautiful and evoked the South to me. Gorgeous instrumentals. I was awestruck at that point. I remain awestruck today. What band combines all of this so brilliantly is a question I've pondered probably more hours than I care to admit. Ultimately, I chose to write a book about it. If the Allman Brothers' music was incredibly interesting and genuinely unique to me, the band's history offered up an entire different way for me to understand it. It fascinated me then, fascinates me today. I consider myself a son of the South, and I've spent much of my life making meaning from its past. To me, the Allman Brothers are a rich well of Southern history. Their story, their music, and their inherent Southernness resonates with me. This is a band that built their aesthetic on excellence in the moment, which they defined as hitting the note. I hear it as authentic, and it's touched my soul deeply for my entire adult life. What we're going to talk about today, in preface to me getting to the contemporary South, is we're going to start with 5 factors that undergird this story. I'm going to start with Duane himself. Of course, there is no Allman Brothers Band without Duane. And rather than go through and sort of explain to you his history and how he got here, I'm going to sort of do a quick overview of why I think he's unique in this particular story. Duane Allman looms large throughout this story and always had. He had a single-minded pursuit of music, openness to the ideas of his bandmates, who were incredible musicians themselves. He had deep loyalty to his home region, to the South, and its musical influences. The supporters he picked up along the way, his family, the families who loved the bandmates, and the family that they created together. Duane most valued 3 things: improvisation, virtuosity, and the live experience. The Allman Brothers Band were a fulfillment of his musical vision. They were a brotherhood of virtuosos playing improvisational, extended songs and jams in front of audiences. At Fillmore East, original compositions and covers offer the ABB's distinct blend of Southern music, driving psychedelic blues rock played with the improvisational freeform of jazz. I don't think I have to explain ABB to y'all, right? I can throw that around here. Good enough? All right. The record's Duane's masterpiece, not only as a guitar player, and I think this is important when you think about an artist. Duane Allman is much more than the lead guitar player of the Allman Brothers Band. He was the band leader, and I think that's vital. He chose bandmates who pushed him. Two lead guitarists, Dickie Betts, who everybody, including Duane, said was his equal. Duane was a star of the highest magnitude when he formed this band, and one of his first moves, well, it was his third move, I guess, but it was to bring Dickie Betts in. Bassist Barry Oakley, a former lead guitarist, commanded the bass as a third lead instrument. They had 3 guitar soloists at all times. 2 drummers, J-Mo and Butch Trucks, provided a foundation that simultaneously grounded the band rhythmically as it propelled the music forward with an unusually powerful sound. On top were Greg Allman's vocals and the magnificent swirling sounds of his Hammond B3 organ. Though he wasn't star at Fillmore East, shows a band of equals. The band plays precise, intentional improvisations, unconstrained by form or format. Each musician plays with a confidence that belies the tightrope that he walks. They were collectively composing complex music in the moment. And momentary composition is a term I stole from Warren Haynes, and I think it's a great way to do it. I'm composing in the moment. No one Allman Brothers concert is the same as another one, even if they play the same songs. They are different because they approach the songs 100% differently. When you listen to At Fillmore East, what you hear is an audience that is an absolute thrall to the band, a band that is playing what they feel, and they're depending on each other to hear their cues and respond accordingly. His bandmates also expressed themselves freely, improvising in conversation. Record buyers loved it, and At Fillmore East became a commercial breakthrough for a band that didn't have a hit signal, and was hit single, much less an integrated band of Southerners. The record's success is the pinnacle of Duane Allman's musical journey, but it marks only the beginning of his enduring influence. At Fillmore East and its success birthed an explosion in Southern music, with Duane's surviving bandmates at the forefront of what we're going to call the Southern rock genre, which I'll discuss in just a little bit. The Allman Brothers Band has offered me endless hours of joyous listening. I love how the musicians integrate themselves into the whole, how soloists conjure up astounding riffs on the fly, and how the band plays behind the soloist, pushing, prodding them forward, backwards, sometimes even sideways. A rock-solid foundation of ensemble playing, each musician making up his part as he goes along. It's a musical conversation, and the Allman Brothers Band are the premier musical conversationalists in rock. I've been unpacking what this band means and why their music struck me like it did for 30 years. The music was special to a lot of people, and I wanted to explain why I found it fascinating. I knew from the beginning Duane was at the center of the story. The model that he set up, and this is I think, the most important part. Duane died October 29th, 1971, right as this record was beginning to take off at Fillmore East. It's a pretty tragic story. I think the ultimate, though, for me, is his legacy isn't that. It's that the band carried on for 43 years without him utilizing the same formula. And by the way, a formula that was very unique and individual to them as a functioning and working unit. The band built their career on maintaining a level of excellence that reflected the standard that Duane had set. The album At Fillmore East that they were following is really an honest look at Duane as an artist and band leader and the definitive artistic statement of that original band. And I say that, I don't say that lightly. There's a lot of superlatives thrown around about At Fillmore East and other records, and most of them, actually all of them, are incredibly subjective. But the fact of the matter is the At Fillmore East was an all-or-nothing option for the band, and their solution was to go and record live in front of an audience, 100%, everything. No overdubs, no mixes or anything else like that. And the album became a big hit. So clearly what they were thinking ended up working as it goes through. I do need to say, I had to make sense of that, by the way, that this wasn't a live album of the Allman Brothers Band, but was instead the band's third album that they had recorded live. The distinction was important for me in helping me understand the album as more than a concert document, like a live record. The Rolling Stones' Get Your Ya-Ya's Out is one I always use. That's not a concert, but it sounds like one. And it's a great record, too, by the way, as it goes through. Without Fillmore East and without its success, Duane's career might have ended up as a tragic just what if, especially when he died. Play All Night, by the way, the book, is my take on this story. Now, Duane's a Southerner. I've mentioned this before, but it's a different South, I think, than we usually think of rural, urban South. And this story, which for Duane begins in Nashville, and then really it begins, launches from Daytona Beach, is really centered around small towns all throughout the South. And you know, towns like Daytona Beach, towns like Jacksonville, which is actually not a small town, Tampa, Sarasota, Florida, Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and Macon, Georgia. Each of these cities had strong connections to federal programs, either the military or the TVA in Muscle Shoals or the space race out in Huntsville. But they were all small towns. We're not talking about a rural-urban divide. Most importantly, it was the South where all this was happening and where they went. Now, I can go in a million different directions when I talk about the South. Suffice to say, this story reflects as many meanings of South as you can conjure. Certainly a geographic and a metaphorical place. And when I refer to the South, I'm mostly talking about, actually, I'll get to that in just a second. Oh, actually, that is right there. I'm referring primarily to the states of the former Confederacy, although the term Southern, and I think Southern culture, and Doug and I have talked about this a lot, extends well beyond these geographic borders. I think some of the most Southern people was Buck Owens and the Bakersfield Sound out west, which wasn't even South. It was Oklahoma, which wasn't part of the old Confederacy. So you see how all of these things mix around. In this book, Southerners are those who born in. I refer to everybody in the band as a Southerner. Most people say 5 Southerners plus Barry Oakley from Chicago. And frankly, Barry Oakley to me is a Southerner. He moved south and never left. He's a lot like my mom. She did the exact same thing. Came south and never left, and was sort of adopted into the culture as she goes through. The South is important not just because it influenced the music. This is really true of all popular music of the era. But this Southern rock idea that comes out is instead the sound of Southern musicians making music at home. They choose to stay in the South. Rankin Sherling argues this represents a defiance in the face of overwhelming disdain from the rest of the nation for the South and its culture. Defining Southern rock, and again I keep using quotes because this is a confusing term for me, but Southern rock, which the Allman Brothers are definitely a part of, is difficult because the influences that converged into rock and roll in the mid-1950s were all Southern to begin with. Subsequent generations of Southerners, black and white, adopted, expanded, and adapted on these forms. Far from the first Southerners to play rock, the Allman Brothers were just the first Southern band to do so successfully from the South in the rock era. Their success opened the floodgates of opportunity for Southern musicians of the rock idiom. The term arrived sometime around 1973. Prior to the invention of the term, the Allman Brothers were just a rock band from the South. And the band members actually, when the term Southern rock comes out, they actually don't care for the term very much, and they don't like it. I find zero reference, by the way, to the term in Duane's life. When music is referred to, it's called heavy, experimental, progressive, blues. It's never called Southern music. Southern, it seems, was a given. Now let's talk a little bit about who these folks are. Oh, there we go. I see what's going on here. Duane formed a band in March of 1969. He had a contract with Phil Walden, Maconite here, and in partnership with Atlantic Records. Phil had that. These two men, Phil Walden and Jerry Wexler of Atlantic Records, founded Capricorn Records as a subsidiary of Atlantic. And that's how they end up. Duane forms the band, and they are signed with that. In March 1969, he begins to gather these groups. Includes African-American drummer J. Johnny J-Mo Johnson in the center, 5 white musicians, bassist Barry Oakley in the beautiful salmon shirt, guitarist Forrest Richard Betts looking like Doc Holliday in his hat there. Drummer Claude Butch Trucks. Where's Butch? Oh, Butch is between Duane and Greg with the other outlaw-looking hat on there. who happens to be an old friend from the Sunshine State Circuit. On March 26, 1969, the day after Christone Ingram is coming to town here, the Allman Brothers officially begin when Greg Allman shows up to 2844 Riverside Avenue in Jacksonville, and they have their first jam together. Every member of the band, these gentlemen here, was a road-hardened professional. Duane and Greg had been touring in a variety of bands since 1965. J-Mo was a jazz man who carved out a career in the touring bands of Percy Sledge, Arthur Conley, Otis Redding. Barry Oakley was from Chicago and started out with pop star Tommy Roe. And man, I swear to God, I listen to Tommy Roe and I listen to Barry Oakley, and I cannot see how those two fit together under any stretch of the imagination. Before he relocated to Sarasota, founded a group called The Second Coming with guitarist Dickie Betts, who knew Duane and Greg. I don't know if you're following, there's a big circle going on here, from different, who knew Duane and Greg from Florida. They had crossed paths. Butch Trucks, the second drummer, also knew Duane and Greg and had played in a band with them for a very brief period of time, about 6 months earlier. Duane and his mates were a lineage of Southern musicians who changed musical history. They incorporated diverse sounds and influences to create distinct musical forms, their own musical forms. Duane is both a benefactor and heir to the culture inheritance of Southern music, which, like the music of the Allman Brothers Band, keeps one foot firmly rooted in the past and the other in the present. Their sound typifies what historians Bill C. Malone and David Strickland describe as core to the Southern musical tradition, a means of release and a form of self-expression that required neither power, status, nor affluence, a body of songs, dances, instrumental pieces, and musical styles, joyous, somber, and tragic, that simultaneously entertain, enrich, and enshrine the musicians and folk culture out of which they emerged. The Allman Brothers Band played contemporary American music that built on Southern musical traditions and trends in an improvisation-heavy attack that favored the ultimate American musical melting pot, jazz. Now, before all this happens, we got to figure out how to sell the product. So we're going to talk a little bit very quickly. I take a segue, and this is, I think it's chapter 10 in the book, but it's a little bit of a segue from the chronological narrative. Because it's important to understand how this worked within the music industry. And I think there's a lot to be said about Phil Walden and Frank Fenter, who's in his picture here, and how things ended. Walden, I think, is a Mercer guy, too, is he not? Yeah, so, but I'm just going to go straight into the story rather than give all this other backstory. You want to read more about it? Actually, don't read my book. Read all the other books, because I didn't get much into it. Phil Walden, I think, is one of the most important players in this story that doesn't pick up an instrument. The album, when Fat Fillmore East becomes a success, it was his payoff for his belief in Duane Allman. He built Capricorn around Duane and fought Jerry Wexler, his partner's efforts to move the Allman Brothers Band from the South, where the group wanted to live. Now, Wexler, this is not, by the way, Wexler and Walden. That's Walden and Frank Fenter. Walden and Wexler of Atlantic had done business before. Otis Redding was signed to Atlantic's subsidiary, Stax Records. Arthur Conley was signed directly to Atlantic. The Allman Brothers were fit well on their roster that had Cream, it had Led Zeppelin, Buffalo Springfield, Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. By 1969, Walden was really a relatively small player in the national industry. He had bet big on Otis Redding, who had died in a plane crash in 1967. And he had forged ahead with plans to open a studio, which Mercer has since reopened down there at Capricorn Studios, Redwall. And he was recruiting a rhythm section. Actually had recruited J-Mo. J-Mo is the only one who showed up to be in that band, the rhythm section at the studio. Duane was the focal point of the Capricorn partnership. I'll use a quote Jerry Wexler said. "I was betting on Phil Walden, but I had an absolute solid belief in Duane Allman." Walden, too, heard something special in Duane. J-Mo recalled, "Phil had really good insight. He was looking for what we got into and eventually became." Among Walden's most significant hires is Frank Fenter, then running Atlantic operations in Europe. Together, they built an empire of Southern music. Their idea was Capricorn was going to be a company, not a label. Their model included subsidiaries, all operating under the Capricorn banner: label, artist management, booking agency, music publishing, merchandise. And if you're thinking about this and saying, wow, this looks like it might get a little bit sticky, it actually did very much get sticky. There's a lot of conflicts of interest going on. For example, Wexler owns Atlantic, which distributes Capricorn, which he co-owns. Walden could choose something best for Capricorn, but not for the Allman Brothers Band. The relationship held together until 1972, when Walden and Wexler actually parted acrimoniously. And then by 1979, Dickie Betts, actually 78, sues Phil Walden and Capricorn Records, and about 1983, I think they finally declare bankruptcy. All debts end up not being paid. It became a problem, obviously, and created some bitterness between the band and management when it went through. I'll say this. Phil tried to revive it through out of Atlanta for a time. I will say that this is a label that produced 9 platinum, 17 gold albums out of Macon, Georgia. And I'll say this, though, its greatest legacy wasn't in sales. It was impact. Capricorn moved Southern music to the forefront in American music by launching the career of the Allman Brothers and helped invent the Southern rock genre. One final thing I want to say about the two of them. Actually, the issue, I will finally do this. Walden is a pretty incredible character, and I use this as a chapter subhead because he had a lot of money invested in the Allman Brothers Band, and he was not recovering that money as they were before at Fillmore East. And the quote that's the kicker for me, I mortgaged everything for this thing. I believed in it that much. And that's always come through with Phil Walden, even when I look at the early stuff, his belief in the sound and his belief in Duane. Probably the biggest thing he did was kept the band in the South, and they ended up here in Macon. And that's where the band ended up finding the audience. And this is the one piece that is different than any other book on the Allman Brothers Band. So if you're going to pick up my book and read it, the one thing I think you're going to see, I know you're going to see, is a lot more of what we would call reception. What are people saying about what the band is playing, and also versus how the band wants to present themselves. I've already said virtuosity, live experience, improvisation. That's what the band wanted. They wanted engagement with the audience as they went. Did that happen? Did the audience feel that? Now, any of you who saw the band in the early days are going to remember it that way. That's a given. But memory changes things. We should know that. So the question is, what were people saying as early as possible we could get when that comes through? We're talking about primary sources there. So the audience is really important. Without the audience, we're not going to truly understand. Without the audience, I think the story's incomplete, is the best way to say that. I'm a fan of this band. You can probably tell there. And I think their music would be great whether I listened to it or didn't listen to it. But they are producing music for consumption, not as a product, right, but to make a living. So somebody has to pick it up and like it. I struggle with this a lot because art, commerce, and think about it. I struggle with myself trying to sell my own books and sell my own product. That there's a line that goes on there, but ultimately somebody has to pick up on what it is you are doing and selling. So that's what we're looking at. And audience is one of those things, really, that I think I do completely different than anyone else. Just quickly, I'll tell you, there's 3 existing band biographies, if you've never seen them or aware. There's a book called A Biography in Word and Pictures that Tom Nolan wrote in 1975. It's this really thin book, big, tiny little print. It's the earliest full history of the band, and he's writing it when they're the top band in the land. They're about to break up, actually, but they are really flying super high, and all these stories get locked in. Everybody's happy. Scott Freeman writes a book in the 1990s, or he publishes it, called Midnight Riders. The band broke up in 1982. He seemed to do most of his interviews in that time period between, let's say, 82 and 87, 88 or something, before they got back in a reunion. So there's a real uncertainty to the book. But again, a lot of the stories Macon really sounds pretty good in that one as well. But the band's reputation is in tatters, and there's an uncertainty about the legacy. The book comes out in 95. At that time, the group had been back together for a few years and was really on an upward trajectory, but nobody knew they were going to last until 2014 at that point. The other one, if you've ever read, a lot of people have, Alan Paul wrote a book called One Way Out. It's really the most thorough book of the entirety of the history, including their eras in Macon, as told by the principals of the story. It's an oral biography. It's not an oral history. That's a really specific thing there. There's two biographies on Duane. My favorite one by far, and I don't think it's really a biography, is Galadriel's book, Please Be With Me, A Song for My Father. I have in my notes, part biography, part memoir, and all heart. It's a real wonderful tale about Duane as a human and as an artist. And it also tells a good story about rock and roll's impact on families, on women, on children, and home life as it goes through. So an important way my work differs, as I said, is that I've included the fan voice as much as possible. I do think personal accounts from the band are good, but eventually they get somewhat limited in the stories that they tell through. So I'm going to give you one example of an audience reception. And what this is this was written sometime after May 11th, 1969, when the Allman Brothers left here and went to Piedmont Park in Atlanta and performed for the first time. And this is Miller Francis Jr.'s lead from the next week's paper. That's Duane on the cover. I think that's a photo Twiggs Linden took. There are times when it's easy to think that rock and roll musician is the most militant, subversive, effective, whole, together, powerful force for radical change on this planet. Other times you know it's true. Rock and roll, our new music, is sound for the head and body, orchestrated, electric, cosmic music that will rip you up by your corporate America roots and set you down just inside the gates of Eden, outside of which we've known for some time now there are no truths. You can't listen to the Allman Brothers. You feel it, hear it, move with it, absorb it, and enter into an experience through which you are changed. You catch a glimpse of the kind of world we are becoming, and you know more now than ever the horrendous load of bullshit will have to drop off on the way in order to give birth to that kind of world. Had the band never found an audience, none of us would be sitting here today. Ultimately, the group's success, therefore, launches a new movement in American music, and it really centers here in Macon and launches from the South. Duane and the Allman Brothers Band were groundbreaking and important before the release of Eat a Peach, but it's the record's success for which they are most renowned. Duane was a singular force in American music and Southern culture, and despite his untimely death at 24, his accomplishments dwarfed those of his contemporaries. At Fillmore East is his artistic masterpiece. Just like nearly all history, the Allman Brothers Band story is one of triumph and tragedy. It also ushered in a new era in the contemporary South, one that ultimately resulted in the election of Southern presidents in 1976 and 1982. That's the South I grew up in. So I'm going to conclude with a story a little bit about the contemporary South. I'm going to try and tie all of this together. This is a story of the South and Southerners that reflects not only the changing South, but also how a historian studies change over time. For me, the study and understanding of history is more than just a career pursuit or lifelong passion. History has helped provide focus to the world I inhabit, and the study of history has changed how I view the world. It's not enough that I know something happened. I want to better understand why it did so as to learn from it. This is particularly true when it comes to historic systemic inequality. It's driven in me a commitment to live up to the commandment to love my neighbor. I resolve to do and to be better, and in doing so, help create a better South, where I make my home. The Allman Brothers Band certainly did that as well. In an era that was fraught with danger, the group made its name on the road, and for the Southern counterculture, that was an intense experience. As Bruce Hampton said, it was life or death. You'd stop at a gas station and you'd wonder if you were going to die. That's no joke. If you had long hair, you were a target. Somebody starts calling you some kind of faggot or something about your long hair, Betts said. We were shocking in those days, and some of those damn cowboys are pretty quick to show their feelings. Traveling with a black drummer added to the volatility. Things sometimes turned violent. Here's a story from Tom Doucette. These guys were messing with us, flipping Dickie's hair. They soon started harassing J-Mo. Dickie just puts his fork down and goes, come on. Soon the guy's on the floor bleeding, and Dickie's sitting back down eating his meal. When the police arrived and harassed the band, the restaurant owner defended them, saying, "This is his party, the guy laying on the ground bleeding. You know him. He tried to push these boys around and they pushed back. Boys, your bill's on me." Though J-Mo has never spoken of the indignities he experienced on the road, his bandmates have. "We were always a little on guard for someone to mess with him," Red Dog said. "We got messed with a lot." Red Dog Campbell, the roadie, sorry. Betts recounted his reaction at the harassment. "They kind of stick out in my mind. I was horrified at that kind of thing." Here's a story from Richard Andre Price, who took Barry Oakley's place in The Second Coming from a June 1969 gig in Merritt Island, Florida. I'm going to read this whole quote. "We got there late in the afternoon to set up for sound check. J-Mo was there setting up too, and all of a sudden the promoter comes up and says, 'Hey, you guys can play, but the black guy can't.' We were shocked and pissed because we were all set up and loved J-Mo. He went through this quite a bit. Prejudice was still rampant in some areas against blacks and long hairs. We gathered around the guy and said, 'If he ain't playing, we ain't playing.' The tickets were already sold. He would have given a lot of money back. He told us the parents around there wouldn't put up with white girls being near or around a black man. He got pissed and backed down concerning the tickets. Then to top it all off, the guy wasn't going to pay us. He didn't make enough money, he said. So all of us went in the office, formed a C shape around his desk and told him we were going to get paid. It got heated. Twiggs Linden said, 'You are going to pay us,' and he jumped over the desk and grabbed him. He was going to kill him. It turned into a scuffle, and all of us had to drag Twiggs off him. Needless to say, he paid. J-Mo was surrounded by 11 white peers, most that were Southern, and we protected him." He finishes with, "Some folks may remember what Twiggs did later in life and did jail time." So really fast forward about 8 months, I suppose, and at Aliata's Lounge, he killed a bar owner who didn't pay them and was found not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. The time on the Allman Brothers Band had driven him insane there. By mid-1970, the band added language to its contract prohibiting exclusion. Quote, "Employer agrees that admission to the engagement shall be open to all, regardless of race, color, or creed, and there should be no segregated facilities." The band could cancel for noncompliance, and I reached Willie Perkins at one point and asked him. He said we never had to cancel due to noncompliance. While the 5 white musicians in the band may not have overtly campaigned for civil rights, their support and inclusion of their African-American bandmate is significant. Greg described perennial redneck questions. Who are them hippie boys and who's that N-word in the band? We dealt with that second question quite a bit. Keep in mind this was the 1960s. We were in the Deep South, so having a black guy in the group came up a lot. But J-Mo was one of us, and we weren't going to change that for nobody. Being an integrated band was a way bigger deal than the principals remember. Macon was just barely integrated when the Allman Brothers arrived in April 1969. Mama Louise Hudson remembers she had no white customers at the H&H. And nobody around here had seen guys who looked like them. I had not. A lot of white folk here did not approve of them long-haired boys or of them always having a black guy with them. A.J. Linden, Twiggs' brother, recalls visiting the band's communal home at 309 College Street. I remember seeing a little blonde head on J-Mo's chest and thinking, well, this is different. The arrangement was indeed different, but Macon did seem to accept the band with relatively few hassles. Dickey said, "We were a little apprehensive about going to a real small southern town. We were some pretty off-the-wall characters." Despite his path-breaking role as a black musician playing in a rock band from the South, J-Mo eschewed an activist label. "I never really considered myself some kind of civil rights crusader or anything. People were already doing that long before me." I really genuinely do think J-Mo understates how significant having an integrated Southern band in this era was. With him in the band, the Allman Brothers flouted racial conventions. In doing so, they not only broke down barriers in the South, but challenged stereotypes about white Southerners that existed in other parts of the country. Dismantling these racial boundaries was not a political act. The group was sending a more subliminal message. Its music and cultural roots included African-American music and a kinship with Southerners of all races. This is true throughout Southern culture, if you ask me, and what I look at. Music is one of our most significant resources. It's the taproot from which all popular American music emerges. Southern music is where British and African folk traditions first intersect in a society that's long defined by its limitations: poverty, slavery, suffering, deprivation, cultural isolation, religious extremism. Southerners transcended limitations through music, the Allman Brothers Band among them. Crossing color lines was an act of rebellion. For Duane, Greg, and the rest of them, it was worth the risk. And it went all the way back to Daytona Beach for Duane. As Floyd Miles, their friend, said, they were called hippies because they had long hair and were weird. The bond was built between us because we all experienced some kind of discrimination. We had each other and we had the music, Greg recalled. The Allman Brothers Band and Macon helped change the South and therefore the nation for good. I'm going to wrap this up. Perhaps it's because I spent the majority of my career leading, working with, or before, on behalf and within state and local history that I have a bias towards place as a way to understand the past. 2 years ago, I holed up next door to Kevin and Mariana in the place down here on the right and began a final manuscript that became Play All Night. I've been visiting Macon since 1997. There's a picture from that first visit, well before this town embraced the legacy I've just unfolded. And it felt right to begin the final turn in Macon, where the story tragically ended, Duane's story. The following October 29th, on the 50th anniversary of Duane's death, I was in Muscle Shoals putting the finishing touches on the book. I was there where it all began for Duane. It was there where it all began for Duane that I began to make my own connections to the South and my Southernness. Once again, the unending conversation inspired me. I spent the week in Muscle Shoals. I listened to a lot of Jason Isbell and Drive-By Truckers. I didn't tell Doug about any of this. He totally set me up with this. And Drive-By Truckers. I read Stephen Dusner's book, Where the Devil Don't Stay. If you like Southern music and good, it's a fantastic book. It's really good. Like me, Dusner connected with a band, the Drive-By Truckers, and his own Southernness. And I'm not going to get into all of this history here, but it's deep, and it connects directly to the Allman Brothers Band. The Drive-By Truckers, originally from Muscle Shoals, Alabama, made their bones actually up in Athens, so they're a Georgia band, I guess, just as much as anything. Their founder, Patterson Hood's father, David, played bass on Wilson Pickett's Hey Jude with Duane, and a number of other things. I'm just going to bring it right back to the Allman Brothers here. They're one of the most important Southern bands of my generation for a variety of reasons. Their songs are about the South and Southerners and all that entails. Patterson coined a phrase called the duality of the Southern thing on one of their early records, and it's something I've long struggled with about my beloved South. How can a region that's given the world such beauty and cooperation in its music and arts be so casually accepting of the long tail of racism in Southern life? How can a region so friendly in one-on-one interactions be so callous about the impact of the past to the present? I'm a Southerner as much by upbringing as by geography. Born in 1971, I only attended integrated schools. I was taught to be fearful of black students. I'm a Southerner who grew up in a small beach town in South Florida and made my history bones in Mickey Mouse land of Orlando. I'm a Southerner who currently lives in the deep South of Middle Tennessee. I'm a Southerner who chooses to celebrate the culture that overcomes racism through music and art. I think it's the best of the South, as are the Allman Brothers Band. So in conclusion, I'm going to use these two Southern bands, the Allman Brothers Band and the Drive-By Truckers, one from before my time and one for my time, to look at change over time, and specifically how musicians have dealt with divisive stories from our past. So I'm going to back up 50 years, give or take, 1973. By 74, Southern rock had taken over. It was a term, it was in a newspaper. Bands were doing extremely well all throughout, your Capricorn bands, and Skynyrd, and everybody else as it goes through. About that same time, it somehow became a good idea to start flying the rebel flag on stage. 50 years later, the condemnation of such imagery is near universal in the music community. But Southern rock bands, including the Allman Brothers Band, seem to pay little attention to the reality that flying the rebel flag redeemed the racism in their midst. Yet even in the 1970s, the prominent display of the rebel flag led critics and fans to dismiss the South and Southern rock as preternaturally backwards, behind the times, and racist. And honestly, displaying the rebel flag was exactly these things. Southern rock's embrace of Confederate imagery signaled public acceptance of segregationist ideals. Well, while band members, almost all educated in Southern schools, considered their flag, white band members Almost all educated in Southern schools considered their flag waving as an expression of regional pride and defiance. Did it fall out? All of a sudden, I just realized the microphone he's been listening to was like in my pocket. Okay, here we go. Is that good? A little better? Did you hear me like scraping? That's funny. You're going to, okay, thank you. And let me, excuse me, and find where I'm at. We were taught, I was taught, that flag represent regional pride and defiance. The band in the era when the Allman Brothers were flying it on stage and using it in merchandising was one, actually, here's a picture, was 1/3 black. They had a black bass player, Lamar Williams, and a black drummer, and J-Mo. I have never seen either of them comment. Lamar has been dead since 1983, and I haven't asked J-Mo, and I don't really intend to. How did the flag become such an innocuous symbol? In all honesty, how were we able to ignore that? Or how were they able to ignore that? And I can't answer that except musicians don't pay attention to that kind of stuff, and it's a merch issue too. They were on t-shirts. They don't necessarily pay attention to that. I know in hindsight, they've all expressed some reservations about doing that, and even some embarrassment when they go. But how does the flag become an innocuous symbol? Southern schools taught the Confederate flag was just, and the flag signified rebellion and the American Revolution spirit, rather than an act of treason against the United States to create a Southern slave nation. The acceptance of the flag throughout Southern culture was a success of the lost cause narrative that framed the Civil War as a valiant defense of Southern virtue against overwhelming odds. This was the understanding of Civil War memory that I was told as well. Racially integrated from their founding, the Allman Brothers publicly pushed back against affiliation with the rhetoric and symbols of the lost cause. As Dickie said, we had nothing to do with that whole ideal, the South will rise again. We did appreciate our culture, and a lot of people in the South were proud of the Allman Brothers because we were typically and obviously Southern. That was part of our aura. But beyond that, I don't think we were part of what was changing the South. It was people like Jimmy Carter and Martin Luther King Jr. and John F. Kennedy who helped affect Southern attitudes. We were just a good thing for some people to identify with, and obviously we influenced the music from the South a great deal. A lot of musicians thought, hey, they're speaking for or representing the way I feel. And that was a cool thing. Once again, I believe Dickie Betts undersells the Allman Brothers Band role here. The band changed the South well beyond just its music. This is an integrated band that emerged from the South in 1969, just 1 year before Neil Young called out the South in Southern Man. Southern man, better keep your head. Don't forget what your good book said. Southern change, gonna come at last. Toward the end of his life, Greg Allman shared what many white Southerners of his era have also come to understand about the rebel flag's sinister meaning. My best friend in the world, Chank Middleton, Maconite, is a black man. If people are going to look at the flag and think slavery was a positive, then I say burn every one of them. And here's where I, a product of the contemporary South, come in. I believe very strongly with what my colleague Patricia Williams-Lassane said, that diversity is an American legacy, and we should proudly proclaim it as our birthright. We are who we are because of the varied cultural and religious traditions and historical moments, good and bad, that have shaped American history, and thus our collective identity. By embracing the premise that our collective history is storied, complex, colorful, inspiring, and yes, sometimes ugly and difficult to accept, we free ourselves from the albatross of race and thus empower ourselves to see ourselves and the world through new eyes. And here's how this has worked for Bob Beatty, born 52 years ago this month in Ocala, Florida. Though I have ancestors who fought on both sides of the Civil War, I grew up steeped in the glory of the lost cause. My paternal grandmother was a member of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, as was her mother and her mother's mother, who lived through the war and Reconstruction. We couldn't say Civil War in my grandmother's house. It was the war between the states. My father was a member of the Kappa Alpha fraternity, who through at least the 1980s were still taking official photos in Confederate uniforms, swords in hands, in front of the battle flag. Robert E. Lee was one of his heroes. In my adolescent years in the 1970s and 80s in South Florida, the Confederate battle flag flew over the state, that happened again, didn't it? The state capitol building of South Carolina and Alabama, and was officially part of the state flags of Georgia and Mississippi. In all cases, I thought, how cool, they're honoring our heritage. Soon I learned how those flags were used in direct reaction to any number of events in the African American freedom struggle, most notably the modern civil rights movement. This was an example of history being abused in the service of injustice, and it offended my sensibilities. It still does. Fast forward to 1990, when in an undergraduate history of the Old South class, Shirley Leckie, who became my thesis advisor, said, "Make no mistake about it, the Civil War was about slavery." Reared in states' rights arguments of the lost cause, I bristled. I understood slavery was an important cause of the war, but its primacy had remained secondary in my mind. I have been exploring that statement for 30 years now. In 1997, I took a graduate class in history, my first one, 1997, History of the New South. The semester was one of the most profound learning experiences of my life. And I say all this because this is what the humanities have done for me. This is where I am having thought about all of this and how I ended up in front of you talking about the Allman Brothers, with all of these stories pieced together to be who and what I am today. That class in the New South really taught me that I could no longer ignore the system was fundamentally stacked against African Americans in the South, and that I benefited from that in ways great and small. Dr. Fredrickson's class also introduced me to the concept of the lost cause and sparked my attempts to better understand and work to undo the effects of systemic racism and discrimination. I realized quickly I'd been duped by the stories of the glory of the Old South and have spent a significant part of the last 25 years unpacking this and building a new understanding. Such is my duality of the Southern thing. Just as Southerners of Duane and Greg's generation had to unlearn the lost cause narrative, I've had to as well. I'd grown up to venerate the Confederate cause. As a youth, I saw the statues of the lone soldier and or more famous leaders as something to aspire to. Most monuments commemorate parts of my own past. I could see myself in their accomplishments. My father was once quoted, and by the way, I'm not calling out my old man, that he was one of the finest men that ever walked this earth. But I think it's important that you see he was a whole different generation of Southerner than I am, or at least the South I'm willing to accept. He once was quoted as saying, Robert E. Lee embodied all that's good about being an American. But was he? Can we separate the man from the cause he led to create a permanent slaveholding republic in the American South? Many Southerners in the contemporary South, myself included, believe some causes no longer deserve public veneration. Such is the changing South. I think the duality of the Southern thing was evident in the changing interpretation of the Robert E. Lee statue in Richmond in the summer 2020 and summer 2021. It inspired artist Wes Freed's cover image of the Drive-By Truckers' 2020 album, The New OK. Freed, actually just passed away, was a longtime collaborator of the Drive-By Truckers, lived less than a mile from the statue, and documented the protests and dismantling of them. For the cover, Patterson Hood said he liked the visual of the graffiti on the old monument and how that was a sign of those times. So this is the old monument on the left, which they did repurpose as public art. I think it's one of the solutions to monuments and memorials is to allow repurposing. This is all gone now, so that it didn't become same reason, frankly, anyway. On the right then is the Drive-By Truckers cover. He liked the visual of the graffiti on the old monument and how that was a sign of the times. And I'm going to say I did too. Because it represents a new South, one that puts aside clinging to racial animosity that harms others, and remembering that we all should have a role in building the world that we want to live in. I think that's what the study of the humanities is all about, accepting each other's humanness as contributing to the world that we co-inhabit. In my study of the South, I've determined we're better when we look to this future together. The South is mine, the South is yours, the South is ours. It belongs to your children, it belongs to my children, and it belongs to your children's children, my children's children. It belongs to the immigrant, and it belongs to the refugee. The Allman Brothers Band taught me a lot about the South, just as Duane taught me a lot about human potential. As good as Duane was, he understood he was best in the specific ensemble he created, a group where the whole was even greater than the sum of its parts. I think the same for the contemporary South. It's why Duane called out his bandmates at the end of Mountain Jam, at the end of the Fillmore sessions. Barry Oakley, Dickie Betts, Butch Trucks, J. Johnny Johnson, Greg Allman, I'm Duane Allman. Duane understood the importance of others to his artistic fulfillment, and he let others know that. Finally, I wrote Play All Night in 2020 and 2021, a pretty tumultuous time in world history. The ideological and biological pandemics took a lot out of me, just like they took a lot out of all of us. In fact, again, I have to give some credit to my homies over here, Marianne and Kevin, who I was in that picture I showed you, staying right next door to them at an Airbnb, and it was, we reconnected, and they were there for me. It was pretty fantastic. I thought a lot about, at times I struggled to write, unable to compartmentalize the chaos happening outside my doors from the task at hand. Thought a lot about my own life and legacy as I wrote about Duane's. What did I learn from him in this deep dive in the band? I kept coming back to Greg's words from Ain't Wasting Time No More, the first song he wrote after Duane died. With the help of God and true friends, I've come to realize I still have two strong legs and even wings to fly. Duane had taught his brother and his bandmates the responsibility of the living to carry on. Greg reminded the band and its audience, including me, of that charge. But I never miss how Greg said you get through whatever this life thing throws at you. God gives you friends to sustain you through the journey. So to my friends, particularly my fellow museum nerds and history geeks, including my homegirl Cinnamon, I'm very thankful for all of that. Finally, as I wrapped up this project, this is a moment of personal privilege. I consider it a lifetime of lessons I learned from three very dear people who I lost before they got here. The lessons were myriad, but one stood out above all others, the commandment to love thy neighbor. So when I think of my parents, Pat and Susie, and my kid brother, Brian, who died April 2020, this is my Southern inheritance that I cherish the most. And I did not expect to break down a little bit, so please forgive me. And to think it all started at a public library in tiny little Stuart, Florida. So I have one more thing, moment of personal privilege. Please forgive me, by the way. Last weekend, I got to meet this guy on the right. He's in the center of the picture there. Some of y'all from Macon might know Lamar Williams Jr. I got to meet J-Mo. J-Mo's Duane's first recruit. And he told me I was an observant MFer. And I don't know about you, but there is no higher honor in the world than being called an MFer by a jazz man. So I just figured I'm going to do a mic drop on y'all and tell you that, finish with my catchphrase, long live the Allman Brothers Band. And I will take questions from there. Thank you.